So, advance apologies. I will try to keep my enthusiasm under control. I, as I've already told y'all, am something of a nerd when it comes to a class like this. And my interests have, for the last 10 years at least, been very much developed around the Second Temple period. I think that there is something very fascinating about the prophets and what they are doing in their prophecies. We talked last week, and we started to talk about it the week before that, about the role of the prophet. And you took a quiz last week about the role of the prophet. And I think what I've been, well, I don't think, I know, what I've been trying to move you to recognize is that the prophet, when they appear in the Bible, is not just someone who is looking to the future, not kind of forecasting these magical things that will happen in the sky, but a prophet is someone who is able to look at their own circumstances and their own time and understand what brought them and their community to the point that they are arriving at, and also what the consequences of continuing to decide on these things is going to be. So, for example, I know people today in 2025, inside of and outside of a religious context, that I would say that person is a prophet. Like, according to the way that the prophet is depicted in the Bible, that person is a prophet. Because what they do is they look at the news, they look at the headlines, they look at society, they look at the culture, they look at the context in which they are alive. They look at the cultural products like movies, TV shows, and they are able to kind of follow the patterns here and see what is happening. They are able to do the work of looking into why things are the way that they are, how they got to the place that they are at. And also, they're able to kind of guess where things are about to go next. And so, under other contexts, we might call such people futurists. We might call them historians. We might call them journalists. There are all kinds of, more familiar words that we might assign to this role of the prophet. And I find this particularly interesting in terms of the Bible because for me, and I think I've mentioned this in passing briefly, is that for me, when the prophets were presented to me in a religious context growing up, in an evangelical religious community, the way that they were talked about is that there are 60 pages here of things that they wrote. We want to focus on just this one thing, this one or two sentences. And so the entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah is making all kinds of claims, all kinds of statements about their marriage, about the context, about politics, about society, about the people, about themselves. All of these things are really just reduced down to, well, Jesus is coming and the Messiah will set us free. And it's like, whoa, like you missed easily 66 and a half chapters there to focus on just one sentence. I don't know about that. And we do the same thing with the smaller prophets. We look at someone like one of the major prophets like Daniel, who is not that long, and all of what Daniel has to say is that, well, the Messiah is coming. Well, that's not how Daniel would have understood that. Daniel spent a lot of time talking about their own circumstances, about the history of how Babylon came into power, about the different leaders who are in charge of Babylon, about where this is going to go. Daniel, pretty much about halfway through that book, begins to develop this dream about where things are going to go into the future. And the Messiah as a concept doesn't really play a major part in that. We go into the much smaller and what we would call the later prophets like Hosea and Joel and Micah, Malachi. They too are kind of looking forward to a period where things will get better, but not necessarily looking for Jesus the Christ. So they definitely do not name Jesus as Jesus' name. They don't talk about the Christ. They don't talk about any of those things. They just are talking about things are horrible. Things are horrible in the city. Things are horrible in the country. Things are horrible with our politics. We are looking forward to a time of peace. And you probably feel the same way. I mean, if you have turned on the news at any point in the last, 10 years, you probably feel the same way. That there is so much confusion, so much unrest, so much division in our society, here in America and really around the world, that is there any way that things are going to settle out and we will get to a place where we don't have to panic every time a news alert comes on our phones or on our televisions? You are probably bored and tired of some of the movies and TV shows that have been put out because they're all pretty much the same thing and they're all reinforcing the same ideas. I mean, my wife and I, when we sit down and we try and watch TV, we kind of make a joke out of it that, do you want to watch a murder tonight? Because so much of what we in America are watching is murder. Murder, murder, murder. This can become exhausting over a period of time. I mean, how many murders is it going to take before you're like, yep, I got it. The husband did it. Got it. I understand. And what narratives are being reinforced? So here too, I would say the prophets are kind of sick and tired of their circumstances. They're pointing to all of this. And then, like me, and in my circumstance, we just kind of jump forward. And Jesus is in the gospel, and Jesus is doing magical things, walking around, healing people. Jesus is walking on water. Jesus is amazing. He's the life of the party. He goes to a wedding. He turns water into wine. He's great for magic. This is kind of a very... it makes your head snap, because it is not at all what the prophets are talking about. It is not at all what the major prophets are talking about, what the later prophets are talking about. And so we just kind of jump ahead as though this is 400 years of silence, that God is not speaking, God is not saying anything, and then Jesus shows up and everything is a party. And then when Jesus says, well, everything is not really a party. Actually, there's a lot of things that we need to change in our religion, in our society, in our culture. Well, Jesus is killed. And then we move forward. We move forward another 40 years. And then the Apostle Paul takes over in the New Testament. And Paul does all kinds of things that curiously rewrite so much of what Jesus was saying. For example, people come to Jesus at one point and they ask him, hey, in the future, what do you think is going to happen with marriage? Like, are we going to be married to our first wife, to our first husband? Are we going to be married to our third husband, our third wife? Who are we going to marry? Are we going to have lots of wives and lots of husbands? And if we have lots of wives and lots of husbands, who takes primacy and all that? And Jesus is just kind of listening to this question and goes, I don't know why you are so focused on that, since in the afterlife, you will be neither married nor given in marriage. This entire economy of relationships will not exist. You will be doing a lot of stuff far more important and detailed than trying to determine who you're actually married to. I don't even know why you would ask that question. And then 40 years later, Paul will say, wives, you need to submit to your husbands. Paul will say, women should be quiet in a church service. They should not speak and they should not teach. These are very different considerations. If you say, well, women should not speak or teach in the church, as Paul does, then how is it that Paul in his letters is acknowledging so many women who are in the role of ministry? That seems kind of like a jerk thing to do. But if we rewind and we're trying to understand Jesus, Jesus is very clearly trying to elevate the role of women in his context, in his society. He is reconsidering so much and is trying to look forward into this period of time that he does not call heaven, but which he calls the kingdom of God, which is, in Jesus's construction, is something of a reaction to so much of what the prophets would have been talking about. Jesus is trying to idealize a society where we are focusing on things that are more important and of greater importance, not to the individual, but to the entire community, to elevate the entire world, to, in Hebrew, that it would be called tikkun olam, or repairing the world. And this concept in Judaism of tikkun olam is that no one can really repair the world on their own. Even in the Jewish construction of Messiah does not do everything alone, doesn't rebuild or reconstruct the world alone. Messiah is doing this alongside those who believe, those who want to do that, those who are opting into that. So this is a very different economy. And so much of this 400 years of silence, this narrative that exists of 400 years of silence, is ignoring what is actually happening. A lot of ideas are developing socially, politically, religiously, socially, sexually. So much is just kind of in upheaval. One big thing that's happening is that Greece will rise to power with Alexander the Great. We see this being discussed in Daniel's prophecy, in his dream of the future. We have someone that kind of fits the narrative in the position of Alexander the Great, who will come to power and will kind of take over a lot of the Mediterranean, which is at that point the known world, the recorded world. Not exactly true, very ethnocentric in that respect, but very Western-centric, but very much Alexander the Great will fit that role. And then, as Daniel predicts, we will see that Greece will begin to kind of break into different parts. And then ultimately, we will see Greece in its entirety, in all of its disparate parts, taken over by Rome. So that's one thing that's happening. Politically and socially, so much is in upheaval because of this flux, this state of flux. In the Mediterranean world, there are different religious groups like the Zoroastrians and the Hebrews and the Jewish communities. Even in Judaism, you have those who identify with Israel, those who identify with Judah. We get into the Babylonian exile, and then you have those who are deciding to stay in Babylon and those who decide to go back to the nation of Israel and try to rebuild it as much as possible. You see this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah specifically. Nehemiah goes back just to try and rebuild the temple, just to try and rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And Ezra will come in and will try to kind of rebuild the religion. And pretty much straight away, in trying to rebuild that religion, Ezra and the religious leaders of the time will begin to make decisions that will sow their own destruction. One of those being that Ezra comes to power and takes over the temple and says, if you're married to a foreign wife and if you have foreign children, we're going to nullify those marriages as though you never even married. And your children don't matter. They are not part of the household of faith. They just do not exist at all. So if you're trying to rebuild a community and then you immediately say your wives and your children are not part of this community, what are you doing? What kind of political or social decision is that? Where is your religious justification for that? And so it's not too long before the inevitable happens and the Jewish people are once more taken into one of a number of exiles, and they find themselves being scattered throughout the Mediterranean. Now here we could focus on the scattering of the Jewish people and how awful that was to the Jewish faith, or we could take it a different direction. So let me take it in a different direction. In this transition of powers that Babylon gives way to Greece, Greece gives way to Rome, we have something that is remarkable and will be part of one of the first traditions that we want to pay attention to. Those who have been Hellenized. And you will see this being discussed in the Gospels and even in the epistles of Paul, that those who have been Hellenized are those who have given way entirely to the power of Rome. They would say that they're religious, they would say that they are Jewish, they would say that they are many things, but ultimately they have rejected their identity to instead be part of the Roman Empire. Let's be fair. Instead of trying to criticize that decision, like Ezra would do, like maybe Nehemiah would do at the start of it, let's look at the consequences of that decision. If you have been entirely Hellenized and you are going along with what with what Greece is doing, and then with what Rome is doing, you have a lot of currency in society. You are not locked into this identity of being Jewish or part of the Hebrew community. You are not locked into the identity that you are either of Babylon, which was one of the primary exiles, or of Judah, which is those who decided to return from Babylon to the nation of Israel. Your identity is not tied to either of those things. Your identity is very much Roman in nature. And if you are Roman, it's kind of the same as though you were to say, I'm an American. You go into a foreign country and you say, I'm an American. Maybe people look down on you, but there is a lot of currency in saying that you are an American. Whether you agree with that, whether you think that's a good thing or not, there's a lot of currency. An example of this is that a couple of years ago, my wife was traveling with a group of people, and this was before the lockdowns of COVID. I'm sure you can all remember this from your childhood. And she found herself in another country, and she was able to say, I'm an American. And they did what they could to get her and the people that she was with on a plane and get them out. And she's always kind of looked back at that period of time and said, I wonder what would have been the case had I said that I was that I had a different nationality. Like, had I been from another country, would I have been given the leeway that I was given? But saying that you're an American gives you a lot of power. So if you are living in this period of time before Jesus and you are completely Hellenized, you're part of the Roman Empire, you are agreeing to a lot of the culture and society and politics and power and taxation and all of these things that go along with being part of the Roman Empire, you will have a lot of currency. Fast forwarding the tape, Paul at one point is imprisoned and is being beaten, and he says, you should really stop beating me because I am a Roman citizen. And as soon as he says that, the beatings stop, because the people who are trying to imprison him and trying to beat him know that there will come a point where they will have to answer for harming a Roman citizen. There is a lot of fear that goes along with that. So there's a reason why the scattered Jewish community would try to align themselves with Greece and Rome. Culturally, artistically, food and folkways, a lot of these are very important and have nothing to do with the currency, the military power, the social power, the political power that comes with being a completely Romanized citizen. On the other hand, there are other groups of Jewish people who don't want to do that, who are rejecting that for a number of reasons. And I would like to dive into our next video with these different groups. And I'll like to start again with kind of a recap on Hellenization, but then get into what these other groups are looking like and why they would do the things that they're doing.